Transportation is really important, but especially in our research, you know, it's really easy to get into the weeds. So I just wanted to start saying, you know, imagine, how do you feel when you take transportation? How do you get around? What does that look like for you? And then what do you envision? How do you actually want to get around? Is that different from how you get around now? How do you want to feel during your commute, during trips to the store, other daily routes, to reach other essential services? What do you want out of our transportation system? How can things change? So it is really important to change our transportation system. Transportation emissions are the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in both Washington and Oregon. They pollute the air we breathe and are really a big issue, not just for the climate, but also for our health. But we can change this, and what this research demonstrates is that there are pathways to decarbonize, to clean up our air, to make our system feel better. But there is also a whole lot to do, and we really need to start now in order to do that. Stephanie, I might need you to back me up here. This isn't loading for me.
Yes. Are we having technical difficulties?
Yes, this isn't loading. If you could share yours.
Okay,
Thank
I can
you.
do that.
Sorry, y'all, of course, in these virtual webinar days where we're all separate, not all in the same room together and working on our personal computers, this can be quite an annoying thing.
Just a second. Sit tight. No worries. We are. Okay.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Yes, I will be here to can you still see it?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay. It says sharing is paused on my end, but if y'all can see it, that sounds
Strange.
Great. Okay.
I can see it. Awesome. All right. Well, if you can move on to the next slide, please. I do not see the next slide, Stephanie.
Leah, I can share.
Great.
We're back up and running?
Maybe.
Looks like it from my end.
Okay. Can we go up a slide?
Hey Val,
Okay.
I'm sorry to do this. Why don't I share it, since Leah and I have coordinated on the presentation. So if you can turn it off, I'll turn mine on in 1 second. Thanks.
Sorry, everybody. Whew. All right, I think we're good. Okay, so back to it. We can change this just as we change our technical difficulties. Hopefully that's the end of that. But as I was saying, we really need to do a lot to decarbonize our transportation system. This research shows that there is quite a long way to go, but there are also pathways and possibilities. So there's a lot to do, but we really need to start it now. Next slide. So the question that we're answering is, how do we do it? We need to electrify, and we also need to reduce the vehicle miles we travel. So in other words, we need to electrify, but we also need to get more people using active transportation. We need to shift to transit. And we also, by the way, need to switch to 100% clean electricity for almost everything. Luckily, in Washington State, we are on a pathway to 100% clean electricity under the Clean Energy Transformation Act that was passed in 2019. But I would like to note that in Oregon, we need to see a similar policy for any of our decarbonization pathways to work. It is crucial to have a 100% clean electricity grid in order to decarbonize our transportation system as well. If we electrify and if we reduce the vehicle miles we travel, we will decarbonize, we will see cumulative carbon savings, we will see less electricity, we will see fewer chargers that are needed in order to electrify, we will see fewer crash deaths, and we will see more people using active transportation if we do both at once. So we do have choices. As I mentioned, doing both at once is optimal. That leads to a lot of safety benefits, a lot of health benefits, and a lot of economic benefits. However, it is possible to decarbonize everything through electrification, basically by maintaining our current system, how we get around, but electrifying it. That does lead to decarbonization, but this scenario does have some significant additional costs compared to if we combine the two things. If we combine switching to transit, using more active transportation, and electrification. So we have to act boldly and quickly. All of the scenarios that we're going to present today are grounded in rapid electrification that must be supported by policy. But again, the optimal path combines reducing vehicle miles traveled with electrification. And this leads to broader social benefits beyond the obvious. So again, why are we presenting this research in the first place? We want to better inform how we design and advocate for transportation policies. And we are also presenting new analysis on how reducing vehicle miles traveled impacts efforts to decarbonize. What does that mean for our health, for our safety, and for our public spending? So just overall, really quick, I already introduced Val on our team, but we had a lot of folks helping out with this research. Climate Solutions provided the research scoping and overall direction. Val, as I mentioned, created this entire transportation model. And then we also did some electricity sector modeling with E3. I will stop right here and mention that the webinar we're going to do today is an incomplete presentation of the full scope of our research. We have modeled additional scenarios that we don't have time to get to today, as well as the electricity sector modeling. However, after the webinar, we will be posting a full deck online. We will have a recording of the webinar, but an expanded deck that goes into more of these scenarios, so that way you're able to take a deeper look into the research that we have done, and also use that as a resource yourself in order to cite pages and so on and so forth. I'll also mention right here that we're not going into the methodology of the research today. I will say what we did was we created this transportation model with Val, where we modeled not only our transportation system and what that looks like out until 2050, we looked at population growth in different geographies, different rates of electricity, decarbonization. We looked at different rates of electric vehicle update. We looked at different rates of mode shift in reducing vehicle miles traveled and freight impacts. All of that stuff, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get into the weeds today, but we created a really robust model along with Val, and on the expanded deck that we'll present online, we will be showing more of the methodology behind this. We're just not going to be able to get to it today. We're just going to dive right into the results for you. So first of all, we are going to present our reference case. We need something to compare to. So we built up a model that takes a look at business as usual. And if we don't really change anything in Washington and Oregon, if our policies sort of remain the status quo, if we see the same patterns of transportation and we see the same population growth we have been seeing, what does that look like? So this is what we're comparing to. So first of all, greenhouse gas emissions in a business as usual scenario. They don't reduce very much, unfortunately. We need a 95% reduction in the transportation sector from 2020 levels in order to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius or below. We used this in order to align with the Washington Deep Decarbonization Pathways models and the Clean Energy Transition Institute's pathway study for the Northwest. So again, we wanted to align with other studies, but just noting that, for example, in Washington State, the statutory requirements for reducing greenhouse gas emissions go even further than this. So business as usual, as I said, we don't see very much greenhouse gas reductions at all. We see a 4% reduction compared to what we have this year in 2050. That is absolutely inadequate. This is what the graph on the right, and again, in every single slide, I'm not going to go into depth on every single graph because we'll be presenting that online, but just to give you a picture, this is what it looks like in terms of vehicles. Those different colors are electric vehicles in different areas, but we only see about 11% of the passenger fleet be electric, and about a quarter of buses are electric by 2050, and we don't really see much electrification of freight. So we have very, very low electric vehicle penetration under a business as usual scenario without additional policy support for electrification. So in our reference case, we have vehicle miles traveled. In a business as usual case, we see a significant increase in total vehicle miles traveled for personal and freight travel. Passenger miles increase with population. So in a business as usual case, we're actually expecting about a 30% increase. When it comes to freight, the projections for vehicle miles traveled are even higher. We expect about a 45% increase in freight vehicle miles traveled. So in our reference case again, electricity. In Washington, we already have the Clean Energy Transformation Act on the record. So our grid is going to be decarbonized it's going to be completely decarbonized by 2045. However, unfortunately, Oregon does not have a similar law in place. We hope to change that. But I will note, for our reference case, for our base case, we had to have Oregon snap to Washington's policy in order to meet any of our decarbonization goals. It is crucial. It is crucial that we have a clean electricity grid. I also want to note that different benefits accrue differently for different communities. So this is a map here of redlined neighborhoods, and I'm sure many of you know that lower income communities and communities of color are more vulnerable and experience a lot more of the pollution and of the traffic and other negative environmental impacts, including toxics, from our current systems. Racist policies redlined communities of color into areas that were near highways, for example, or near industrial facilities. And as a result, these communities face more toxic air pollution and poorer air quality. So I did wanted to note that. So as a part of this modeling, this is a population graph based on the census, which divides people of color and then Hispanic folks. So this is where folks live in communities of color right now. And based on this geographic distribution, we're also able to allocate where benefits will accrue for our different scenarios. Now for the below poverty level, we're able to do this as well. So we looked at 2 different measures of poverty. We looked at 80% AMI, and then we also looked at people who are at 185% of the poverty level, which aligns with the Washington Environmental Health Disparities Map. So again, we're able to map out where folks who meet these different qualifications live and see how individual benefits accrue to them for our different scenarios. So I'll transition over to Vlad for now.
Thanks, Leah. So we're going to talk about 2 core scenarios, one that focuses on the combination of VMT reduction through transit and mode shift and pedestrian and bike transportation and electrification, and one that focuses just on electrification. And then we'll talk about a little bit more sensitivities on those 2. So the background is, so just to start with the way we frame the electrification question. We looked at a number of scenarios that evaluate the different amounts of electrification and VMT across these different approaches. So the VMT varied in 3 core scenarios. We'll present the first 2. You can see there on the left that low VMT includes a deep reduction, about 27% compared to our current vehicle miles traveled, the current mobility patterns, and I should say 27% about reduction compared to what we might expect by 2050. So it's compared to this reference case, the business as usual case. The reference case assumes that we continue to travel the way we do now. And high VMT is an assumption that we would increase, that we travel more per person than what we might otherwise expect. And then we also looked at what each of these mean for electricity and electricity demand. And so you can see the lowest electricity demand, obviously, is if we continue relying on gasoline. If we deeply increase electrification, but reduce VMT compared to today, we increase the amount of electricity that we need, but not nearly as much as we would if we didn't really focus on VMT reduction, and certainly if we allowed our travel patterns to get away from us. So the scenario 1, this is what we found to be sort of an ideal world scenario where our 2 states focus both on reducing vehicle miles traveled by encouraging folks to switch to transit and other non-car modes, and deep electrification. So what we found is that we can reduce our personal vehicle miles and electrify, and that this yields the most substantial reduction. Passenger miles traveled is deeply reduced across all geographies. We envisioned in this scenario a 15% reduction in freight miles as well, and coupled that with electrification. Doing this, we can increase safety and reduce costs. There are substantial costs associated with continuing to support our current mobility patterns, substantial costs associated with building out road infrastructure. There are substantial costs with serving electricity to a lot of vehicles that we could have eliminated if we reduced VMT, and a variety of other costs in this space. And so what you're seeing here is that what we saw in this model is that by reducing VMT along with electrification, we get the most wide scale benefits across all categories. And so the way we kind of wanted to identify ambitious but still reasonable targets for VMT reduction in our 2 states is we tried to compare Portland and Seattle, Washington and Oregon to other places around the world, and the VMT per capita that we see there. So I'm not going to go into detail here, but what you see here is we modeled Seattle and Oregon, the large cities in our region, to track with London's per capita VMT, which requires in Seattle a 46% reduction compared to today, even though our 2 states are already among the lowest VMT per capita in the country. And we would need Oregon as well to reduce to their VMT by about 29% to match where New York State is as well. So this slide gets into a little bit more detail on that, but the basic wrap up here is that the result is that we identified as ambitious but reasonable a 29% reduction in personal miles traveled, and a 27% reduction in vehicle miles traveled in total across the region, which includes both personal and freight movement. This scenario required near 100% electrification by 2050 across 6 vehicle categories that we evaluated. You'll see that for all the passenger vehicles, we do reach 100%, and for certain freight vehicles, the medium duty and heavy duty, we're allowed to fall a little bit short and still achieve our carbon reduction goals of over 95% by 2050. You'll see the medium duty is around 90% electrified by 2050, and heavy duty is a little less, around 85. But basically, the other 4 categories still reach 100% electrification by mid-century. And what you see is an aggressive reduction in our carbon emissions associated with transportation as a result. That brown line at the top there is our sort of business as usual. As if we kind of let things go the way we are, if we allow the expected emission, we have some electrification that happens if we don't adopt policy to go aggressive. So there's some reductions, but fundamentally we're not really substantially reducing our carbon emissions from transportation over this time frame. But if we do what we just sort of described, you see deep reductions by 2050 and enables us to achieve our goals. And importantly, if you look at the sort of aggregate, the total aggregate social cost of carbon associated with this scenario, we substantially reduce the damage that we're imposing on our climate and our surroundings by doing this. So greenhouse gas emissions fall substantially. You see the tailpipe emissions, which are the greatest source of both obviously greenhouse gas emissions and public health emissions. That scope 1 emissions there fall substantially. A little surprising to us, but it made sense as we looked more closely at it, is scope 2 emissions, electricity associated emissions for transportation actually increase. And that's because while Washington and Oregon reduce their electricity emissions, they don't go to zero until 2045 in this model. And so as we gradually expand our use of electric vehicles while not having fully eliminated carbon from the electricity sector, our emissions actually transportation electricity emissions actually go up before going to zero by the end of the period. But again, even the combination of those two, the increase in electricity emissions and the decrease in tailpipe emissions, yields that carbon emissions trajectory there, that blue line on the left, which is a deep reduction steadily over the time period. We need to substantially increase the number of chargers that we need, that we have available in order to serve these millions of vehicles, electric vehicles and electric trucks and things like that we're deploying. We have about 4,000, I believe around 4,000 chargers in the region right now. In order to serve this substantial expansion of electrification, we need to get up to about 750,000 chargers by 2050 in order to support this system transition. And the total cost of that over the period is around 1.2 to 2.4 billion, depending on some assumptions around cost and the type of chargers that we're deploying. But importantly, one of the important things is even as we kind of invest in our transportation systems, one of the most important and encouraging results that we find is that we're substantially reducing personal transportation spending. Personal transportation spending compared to a business as usual case goes down by over $4,000 by 2050. And that's because folks are able to opt out of cars and opt into micromobility and bikes and transit. Those that stay in cars are able to enjoy the substantial benefits associated with electrification, which is much less, much cheaper to operate today in our region. It costs about a third to drive on electricity as it does on gasoline or diesel. And then of course the reductions in the same energy costs associated with emissions, or associated with fuel costs in trucking and busing and things like that. So what we see is a substantial reduction in how much we have to spend, we individuals, our households have to spend on transportation, even as our society is deeply investing in its transition. And there are major health benefits and other benefits beyond carbon and beyond cost that we can identify, that we were able to identify. So total health benefits across our region by 2050 total as much as $626 million a year. Those benefits come from a variety of sources, meaning coming from fewer hospital admissions, fewer work loss days, and other restrictions. All of this is because we're not breathing the toxic pollutants that come out of the tailpipes of our cars, the particulate matter, the NOx, the other pollutants that are profoundly impacting human health are substantially reduced as a result of reducing our need of fossil fuels. We're also reducing the number of folks that are injured in car accidents and in car crashes and things like that. And you can see those numbers down below, fewer work loss days, less asthma exacerbation, and more. And those these benefits that we've identified for the entire region especially accrue to the vulnerable communities in our states that are currently bearing the bulk of the cost of our fossil fuel and car dependent economy. So for example, we saw just in Seattle $88 million in avoided health costs for people of color and Hispanic communities by 2050, and you see those same benefits translate across all of the regions that we studied. We have fewer asthma attacks across the region, fewer work loss days avoided, and all of those, because those burns are disproportionately burned by fall on people of color and Hispanic communities. This transition especially accrues the benefits to the communities, to those communities as identified. And we found the exact same thing for low-income folks as well. We used, as Leah described, we used two different metrics of income, of poverty, and we found that these benefits accrue disproportionately to low-income people, whether you define that as 185% of the federal poverty line or 80% of the area median income, which varies, you know, in more affluent areas that threshold ends up being higher. And you can see that these benefits are substantial. Health benefits for low-income folks in the Seattle area total $55 million in avoided health costs by 2050, and you can see again that tracks across all of these geographies, and as well as the other metrics, including the reduced asthma exacerbation, work loss days, et cetera, and that's consistent regardless of which poverty definition you choose to rely on. We have a massive increase in the number of people that are opting for transit and active transportation. So we would increase the number of people in our region that are relying on transit by about 1 million people annually, and 250,000 more people walk, bike, and use micromobility options compared to what we might otherwise expect. And fatalities, we see substantial reductions in the number of fatalities coming from car crashes if we really focus on this VMT reduction and transition to lower reliance on cars than we have today. 205 people will get through 2050 compared to if we didn't make this investment. That's 205 lives not lost to unnecessary car crashes that are the result of our kind of reliance and dependence and continued fealty to car culture. And so this is a substantial, we're saving hundreds of lives every year consistently for decades going out. And so our ability to make this investment is not just about pollution, it's not just about health, it's also about direct lives lost, people who are able to continue to thrive and live in our region because they're not subject to car crashes that take their lives. So while we didn't get into the electricity sector, we did, in this particular scenario, we do have costs associated with an analysis associated with a total cost. And so what's important here is that what we're spending on direct costs for roads and transit is about $15 billion a year in order to effectuate this transition. And so that's a reduction in our road spending compared to what we might otherwise expect. If we have a huge influx and continued growth in car dependence, then we will need to sort of support a road system that allows all those folks to get around. And so there are $2.3 billion in annual savings associated with our road infrastructure, but we have to invest more in transit, which goes up by a little bit. And so for an extra $200 million a year compared to this business as usual case, we get all those benefits. We get longer lives, we get healthier lives, we get fewer deaths and more. And remember that even as our system costs might increase slightly, our personal costs, our personal transportation costs fall by about a third. Leah, I'll hand it off to you for the electrification only scenario.
Great, thank you so much, Vlad. So as Vlad just presented, that first scenario, what we're calling scenario 1, is the optimal path. This is where we see the most benefits accrue, not just in terms of carbon reductions, but also in terms of safety, health, economic spending for individuals. But this scenario 2 also gets us to our decarbonization target of 95% reduction by 2050. So we'll go into what this looks like if we don't change our mobility patterns, but simply electrify. So on the right, we see what our current mobility patterns are. Business as usual travel patterns for both freight and for personal travel. You can see that they are increasing. So this scenario looks at increasing vehicle miles traveled as a business as usual scenario. But what happens if we just transition and go nearly 100% electric? There are significant health benefits that come from zero emissions vehicles being on the road. Next slide. However, of course, this requires significant change in investments. So as I said, nearly all vehicles will have to electrify by 2050. And this scenario does get us to our decarbonization goals, but not quite as many benefits as combining with the reducing vehicle miles traveled scenario that I just presented. So similarly, we see nearly 100% electrification of our fleet. So you see with cars, we get to 100%. With heavy duty vehicles, we're getting close to 90%. But this is the same rate of electrification as in the previous slide, only we did not change how many vehicle miles traveled. So what does this look like for greenhouse gas emissions? Again, we can decarbonize by electrification only. With this scenario, we're able to get to a 96% reduction, so we just beat our goal. Again, as Vlad mentioned, we see a similar pattern for scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. Tailpipe emissions go down. However, as we electrify, electricity emissions go up, but then we decarbonize and they go down again. So just noting that that clean electricity sector is so important. So with this scenario, we see health benefits from the reduced tailpipe emissions. As you can see, by 2050, the results of this scenario compared to the prior scenario are actually pretty similar. Once you get to zero emissions vehicles on the road in 2050, the health impacts are not super different. However, what's really important about this scenario to note is that the benefits accrue a little bit more slowly. So in the near term, if we're reducing vehicle miles traveled, we're preventing air pollution. But in this scenario, by 2050, we do see tremendous health benefits that do come with switching over to zero emissions vehicles. Similarly, we looked at what does this look like for different populations, and the story is pretty similar. Again, you will see some near-term benefits, but by 2050, we see significant overall benefits in both scenarios. However, we do see actually, in the near term especially, but we see about 15,000 fewer folks are exposed to higher levels of pollutants by 2050 than in the optimal scenario, which combines vehicle miles traveled reductions with electrification. So again, this scenario presents benefits, but not quite as many benefits as the scenario we went over before. Similar story again for lower income communities. So I won't go through all the graphs on here, but this is pretty similar to the previous scenario. We get tremendous benefits, especially by 2050, but in 2025, a little bit earlier, we start to see these occurring more quickly when we reduce vehicle miles traveled. In this scenario, that's electrification only, we're seeing them accrue a bit more slowly. So when we look at personal transportation spending, switching to electric vehicles is actually pretty helpful. So when we look at our personal spending, gas and oil account for about 22% of our personal transportation spending on the West Coast right now. So depending on where you live and what your driving habits are, people could see $1,000 to $2,000 in annual savings solely from switching over to an electric vehicle, because it's cheaper to fuel your vehicle with our low-cost electricity in this region than it is to power it with gas. So for the average family, you'll see about $2,000 saved on gas and oil, and instead you're spending about $200 to $250 on electricity as fuel. So there's a pretty big difference. However, we're assuming that transit costs remain the same, and so this scenario does cost about $2,500 more per year for an individual than in the previous scenario that Vlad described. So this is better than business as usual, but not quite as good as the optimal case we just presented. Regarding electrification infrastructure, of course, this scenario is solely relying on electrification, and we're not reducing vehicle miles traveled. So we're going to have to see a lot of investment in electrification infrastructure. We did in the last scenario, but we need to see even more in this scenario. So compared to the previous scenario, we need about 195,000 more chargers compared to the previous scenario. So that's quite a significant investment that we're going to need to make. In terms of vehicles, we'll need about close to 4 million more EVs on the road compared to the previous scenario. So again, we can decarbonize, but this one is a bit more costly in terms of what is needed if we don't pair it with a vehicle miles traveled methodology as well. When it comes to the overall costs and benefits, this is what this looks like. Electrification only compared to the previous scenario. Overall, society saves about 3 to 4 billion less in the social cost of carbon because we see carbon emissions accrue more rapidly in the previous scenario. We also see fewer lives saved annually. you know, the crash impacts are quite significant from high vehicle usage. And so if we don't reduce the vehicle miles traveled, you're still going to see a lot of road accidents, unfortunately. Also, the personal transportation spending is, like I mentioned earlier, higher. Each person will have to spend about $2,500 more in this scenario than in the scenario that pairs electrification with vehicle miles traveled reductions. Annual direct costs paint a pretty similar picture. So if you look at what we need in terms of incremental electricity costs to fulfill what we need in order to power all of our vehicles through electricity, and you add that to road costs and transit costs, you're going to see a pretty different picture here. So in the first scenario, which was the optimal scenario, we saw a lot of investment that was needed in transit, of course, as more people are using it. In this scenario, we see fewer investments needed in transit because fewer people are making that switch. However, when it comes to road costs, maintaining and expanding roads is quite expensive. So in this scenario, we see almost $10 billion in order to maintain our road system without reducing our vehicle miles traveled. So all in all, these two scenarios sort of mesh out when it comes to our road costs plus our transit costs plus our incremental electricity costs. But noted again, the personal transportation costs of the optimal scenario are much lower than this electrification only scenario. So when I want to summarize the direct costs, this is pretty much the other slide that I just showed, but displayed in a different way. You can see that VMT reduction plus electrification is quite a cost saver when it comes to, you know, total societal costs and individual costs. If we electrify only, if we look at that scenario, we see that costs a bit more than reducing VMT and electrifying. And then finally, on the web version of this webinar, of this deck, we will show a third scenario where we look at what does it look like if we electrify but increase our vehicle miles traveled, and that accrues even more societal costs directly. All right.
Thanks so much, Leah. And thank you. And we're going to talk about a couple of other sort of sensitivities that we tested that had somewhat less comprehensive modeling in terms of the electricity side, but sort of illustrated what happens if we make certain different choices on VMT and related and electrification rates. So first of all, we wanted to check what happens with carbon emissions if we do a deeply aggressive reduction in our reliance on cars, but didn't have policies and policy supports that yielded additional electrification beyond what we're already expecting, beyond the kind of business as usual adoption that some models project. So what we evaluated was a 55% reduction in vehicle miles traveled compared to business as usual, which is sort of an unprecedented amount of reductions to achieve over the course of the next 30 years. It's a little bit more ambitious than Washington's goal of 50% reductions. But if we do this and we don't incorporate additional electrification, aggressive conversion of our vehicle fleets to electricity, we still fall 50% short of the reductions we need in carbon emissions. We took that scenario and wanted to see what electrification rates we would need in order to actually still achieve the carbon emission results. And the outcome was pretty much the same ones as we expected before. We have much fewer cars on the road as a result of a 55% VMT reduction, but we still need 97% of them to be electric, 96% of medium and heavy duty freight to be electric, and 98% of buses to be electric by that time frame. So while the rates of electrification, the share of electrification is essentially non-negotiable. That while there are massive benefits from deep VMT reduction, if we are to achieve our carbon reduction goals, we need to pair it with deep electrification of all the remaining vehicles on the road. We also wanted to look at what happens if we sort of delayed electrification. Is it possible to, pardon me, is it possible to kind of wait a little bit or not be as urgent on the electrification? And what does that mean for achieving our carbon goals? And we did it under a business as usual VMT scenario, the electrification only scenario, and the low VMT scenario, the optimal scenario. What we found is that we really can't afford to delay electrification. While there are massive benefits and carbon reductions associated with VMT reductions, fundamentally electrification is necessary. In each of these scenarios, delaying electrification by 5 years, 10 years, and 15 years, regardless of which of the two VMT pathways we chose, we still fall short of our goal. A 5-year delay is just a 4.6% short of our goal if we also cut VMT. And if we delay electrification by 15 years and cut VMT, we're 40% short. So fundamentally, what we found is that this optimal pathway and the centrality of electrification for our carbon reduction goals is absolutely necessary, and we maximize our benefits if we also couple that with deep VMT reductions as well. So there's a bunch of. This is a great model. It was incredible work by Val, by E3, but it raised a number of questions for us and needs for future modeling. Looking at economic impacts, land use impacts, Scope 3 emissions, all of the emissions associated with constructing this system that we're describing, whether it's roads or cars or buses or trucks, all very important. There are other pollution impacts, including the resuspended particulates from the roads that we weren't able to model, traffic congestion impacts and associated time spent, all were not built in here. And we focus on electrification, but there are other fuel-based strategies for transportation, which primarily include biofuels and hydrogen-based solutions, which from our perspective are primarily need to be focused in the freight sector. The main benefit of those, or one of the main impacts of those, would be altering the electricity load impacts in different ways, although not necessarily through reductions in electricity use, because hydrogen, for example, requires a lot of electricity to produce. Clean hydrogen does, and so those fuel choices would alter that outcome as well. So I'll pass it back to Leah for some key takeaways, and then we can kick it over to questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Vlad. So to sum everything up, what does this all mean for our transportation system and for our advocacy? So this is the future that we want to see, I hope, where we see clean air, we see folks getting around in a way that works for them, we see economic savings, health savings, safety benefits. So in order to meet that optimal scenario that we demonstrated, we really need to act big and fast. We need to reduce vehicle dependence and electrify. We need to hit near 100% by 2050 in order to decarbonize. Doing both together is really important, but we need to take a lot of action. So just in sum, electrifying is good for us. When we electrify, we see significantly improved health and air quality. We also reduce how much we spend to get around, and we do address climate change. We can decarbonize by electrifying. We can also choose our health and our climate and do that in a speedier way if we pair this necessary electrification with increasing transit use, increasing biking and walking, and making it so people don't have to rely on their vehicles as much. And when we combine these things together, we see even more health, safety, and economic benefits. So we want to sort of share, 100% clean is closer than you think. We know what we need to do. We know that we need to rapidly electrify as a foundation. And we have the technology to begin this process, but we do need really, really strong policy support. So what kind of policies are we talking about here? What do we need? We need to support rapid electrification now. We also need to invest more in transit and making it safer for folks to get around in active ways like walking and biking and other ways to reduce vehicle trips. It also means we have to improve our land use policies. We need to make it so people can easily access their jobs, essential services, the grocery store, daycare, whatever it is. We need to make it so the way people live and where they work and where they go are not totally spread out from each other, and that people are able to maybe walk or maybe bike or use transit to get around rather than have to rely on a car. So we do need to look at our land use policies as well. And in all of our policies, we really want to not only prioritize climate, but we also want to make sure that they're good for our health, they're good for safety, and they are good for the economic well-being of all folks, not just a few. So again, really seeking to look at our policies through that lens. We think this is possible. We know what we need to do. Again, we need to electrify almost everything, and we need to reduce our overall vehicle miles traveled. We need to do this for a stable climate and also for our collective health, safety, and economic well-being. There's a lot to do, but now we have the pathways and we know the positive results that come from these pathways. We can share what these air pollution reductions look like in terms of our health, what reducing vehicle miles traveled looks like in terms of our safety, what electrifying looks like in terms of our health, in terms of a stable climate. So we have a lot to do on the policy front, but we are absolutely ready to do it and use this research as a basis to demonstrate the real benefits of pursuing the optimal pathway here. And with that, we'll set it up. We've had some questions coming in, so Vlad and Val and I think, will be ready to answer a few questions before this webinar ends.
Hey there, folks. This is Kimberly Larson. We're going to have our panelists go on video for when we're answering the questions, so you're not just staring at a big question mark green screen. And we want to, first of all, thank you, everyone, for attending. We want to move right to questions to save time. And then again, we'll be sending this out. There have been a few questions about that. Wanted to move first to a question from Kelsey, who has asked a really great question about what are the biggest hurdles in Washington and Oregon then. There's obviously different political landscapes, policy landscapes for each state, but what are the biggest hurdles to electrification to the extent that we need, assuming freight issues maybe, but would love to first turn it to Victoria Parker, who's our Oregon transportation advocate, to answer for Oregon, and then we'll go to our Washington team to answer for Washington quickly, and then we'll take the next question.
Hey everyone, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks Leah and Vlad and everyone for the presentation. So for the biggest hurdles in Oregon, I would say that for the electrification, we need to really focus on how we're expanding infrastructure. Here in Oregon, we're looking to expand, for example, medium heavy duty electrification now that California has passed the advanced clean truck rule down there. So thinking about infrastructure in a way that supports electrification and other near zero or zero emission technologies. And then also, I would say the biggest barrier too would be like the total cost of ownership. So making sure that folks can have that transition to electric vehicles, thinking about small businesses, minority businesses as they shift to medium heavy duty zero emission technologies.
I agree with the Vlad. So I agree with the things that V touched on. I'd say that for my perspective, you know, electric vehicles, cars, trucks, buses provide substantial savings to their owners, but they also have higher upfront costs. And so our policies that we've been pursuing in both states include ways to reduce that upfront cost to make it possible for more people to get into them in the first place. Policies like the Clean Fuel Standard, the Clean Fuels Program as it exists in Oregon, which Washington does not have yet, will produce in Washington as much as $3,600 in value that can be returned to customers per vehicle that gets deployed, according to a study by the Union of Concerned Scientists. That makes it easier for people to afford to get into those vehicles in the first place. EV incentives that make it possible for folks to afford those vehicles are important too, and we need similar policies to support heavy-duty electrification for buses, transit, freight, etc. I think the other piece that's worth mentioning is that number, that 750,000 charger number, is a big number. Like we should acknowledge there's a substantial investment in charging infrastructure that needs to happen. And one of the greatest obstacles that people have is, you know, for those people that have a dedicated parking spot or a garage or live in a single family home or whatever, there is a place where they can put that charger. But we need to make it possible for everyone to be able to access electric vehicles, not just those who live in single family homes, especially as we talked about, we need more compact development and land use strategies that encourage people to get out of cars in the first place. And so providing charging for what people sometimes call garage orphans People that don't have an overnight charging opportunity is super important. They need to be able to charge either at a public fast charger, workplace charging, other places like that, in order to make sure that electrification is accessible to everybody.
There's a couple of combination of questions I'm going to just put together. So one is post-COVID, we're going to likely see continuing discomfort with people being on buses and transit, wanting to know, essential workers are still taking the buses. We know we need the bus lines, they're essential, and long-term they will be too once we get through all of this. How do we envision vehicle miles traveled given the post-COVID world, as far as just public confidence in transit and safety and health for a whole host of other reasons? And there was also other questions too within that as far as just how do we get there with this like vehicle miles reduction as far as personal vehicle miles reduced? Is it through single occupancy use reduction? Is it through just more transit? So kind of a package of those questions there as far as that reducing the personal miles traveled, but how do we do that post-COVID with transit also in the public confidence? So I don't know who wants to take that on as far as that package. That'd be great to kind of address the theme of those questions here.
Yeah, I can give it a shot. So regarding coronavirus, I do want to sort of lift up what Kimberly just said, that a lot of folks still need to use transit. They are essential workers. And a lot of folks also don't have the ability to drive for some reason or another. So I did want to sort of highlight that system is really essential. There are, of course, folks who haven't been using transit as much since coronavirus. I do want to note that we see a lot of places around the world where folks have they have continued to use public transit and are still using public transit because their handling of the virus has frankly surpassed ours. I think that we will see some lack of confidence in public transit, but I do think that there are ways to make it so folks can use public transit and they can do so in a healthy manner, and that we will rebound from this. That said, there are some really significant challenges, unfortunately, at the state level to funding transit. And I know that ourselves, along with a lot of other advocates, are really working on how do we fund the transportation system that actually works for people, the transportation system we need. We certainly need more progressive revenue that is also climate friendly, that can then be reinvested in not just transit, certainly a lot in transit, but also on making active mobility much safer as well. So at Climate Solutions, we're doing a lot of work with a lot of different partner organizations to look at how are we spending our transportation dollars and how can we change our revenue and investment system. So the way we generate revenue is flexible and it can be spent on transit. Right now, a lot of our revenue is earmarked to be spent on roads. And we're working to change that, and we're happy to engage. We will be providing more information in an upcoming webinar we'll be doing, so stay tuned on that, and certainly continue to engage with us and down in Oregon as well, as we work to sort of tackle our transportation financing system, which certainly needs to improve vastly in order to make transit a lot more accessible and expanded for folks.
Great. We are noting all of the questions that are coming in because there are a lot that we're not going to get to live. We just, with our tech glitches, we had to cut this Q&A part a little bit short, so apologies for that. But wanted to note actually a simple question that came in as far as just cost savings. Were the cost savings that we're seeing per person, per driver, or per household? And Val, I'll turn that question over to you as the primary researcher here, if you could answer that.
Great, yeah, and what we did here is look at these are actually per person. We looked at all of the money that was being spent to move people either through their personal cars or through their buses and how that changed. And then we just, summed up all that money that was being spent in the different states and regions and divided by the people. So that's what that is right now.
Great, thank you so much. There are a number of questions in here about electricity demand as we electrify more. And so with the time, we don't have to get into that, but we do definitely want to answer that question in the writing. So we'll send that out as far as things to consider, because we obviously want to move off fossil fuels even as we electrify more. And the answer is not more dirty or dangerous energy to solve the problem. So we will make sure to address that. I want to turn it over, given the time we want to wrap, to Stephanie Noren, who will then mention a few other wrap-up items. And again, really appreciate everyone's time, attention, and commitment to these issues, especially while we have the smoke. It's all the more reminder of how we need to clean up our air and move beyond fossil fuels. Thank you. Stephanie, take it away.
Thanks everyone for attending. Thanks Vlad, Kimberly, Val, Leah, V, for your perseverance through tech issues. Though it's hard to recover, so I think thanks to everyone who stayed tuned in as well. Just a quick note, again, this is a part of our Climate Leaders Live series, which happens every second Thursday of the month. And next month, we'll be talking about how our climate and our public health are linked. I think it's been a pretty hot topic the last couple of months or throughout the summer. And I'm sure for many of us who are located on the West Coast, you're seeing a very clear, visible connection between the air that we breathe and our changing climate. And so we'll be hosting that in partnership with Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility. We'll be talking a lot about public health and some other interesting things that are going on. You can always find out what's going on at climatesolutions.org/events. And we'll send out the recording with the associated slide deck afterwards to all folks who registered. And again, really appreciate your time this morning, and thanks for spending Thursday mornings with us. All right, we'll see you all soon.